Hi, I just got off work, and I've tried recording this video like 6 times and it keeps being too long, so I'm going to try to keep things concise this time. So, how has pornography been pushed into the mainstream? I would argue that it first entered the mainstream in the 1960s and 70s after the sexual revolution. If you look at films like Deep Throat was a pornographic film that was widely consumed by society and really did enter the popular culture. Couples would go and see it. There were reviews about it in local newspapers. That was really the first piece of pornographic material that was considered, socially acceptable to go and see. In fact, there was a certain social status associated with being able to go and watch Deep Throat, to the point now that if you mention Deep Throat now, almost everyone knows what it is and what you're referring to. Fun fact, Sephora, the company I work for, we sell a brand called NARS, who has a blush called Deep Throat, and whenever I show it to women, they chuckle when they see it, especially women who are in their 40s or 50s or 60s and actually remember when Deep Throat kind of entered into the mainstream. I would say, though, that it didn't really fully enter the mainstream until the invention of the internet, because it made it possible to consume pornography in the privacy of your own home, whereas previously you had to actually go to a movie theater that showed pornographic films or go to a proprietor that sold pornographic magazines and purchase a magazine from them, which always ran the risk of your neighbors or your family or friends seeing you buy material that inevitably you were going to masturbate to. But now that it has become a private activity, more individuals have been able to readily engage in its consumption, which means that it has been normalized. How does it affect our culture? I would say it has both negative and positive effects. We don't offer comprehensive sex education to children, so they don't really know what healthy relationships and healthy sexual dynamics look like. So when they consume pornographic material, not knowing what a healthy relationship should be, they unfortunately oftentimes think that the relationships and dynamics that they see on the screen are representative of normal relationships, and they're not. Not everyone has flawless makeup. Not everyone has a perfectly toned body. Not every woman is okay with having a penis in, every orifice of her body. Not every individual wants to be bound and gagged. Not every individual wants to engage in rough sex. So when young individuals consume that and they think that's normal, it then has the potential to lead them have unhealthy relationships with others and unhealthy expectations of their sexual and emotional partners. I would say the good part of pornography, though, is it can be a way to learn about one's own interests and one's own physiology, and what enables them to experience pleasure. You said to be candid, so I'll use myself as an example. I became sexually active at the age of 16. I didn't have my first orgasm until I was 21 years old. And it's because no one had ever told me what a clitoris was. No one had ever told me what female pleasure looks like. Nobody had ever had a healthy discussion with me about what I should ask of partners in order to enjoy the experience of having sex. I didn't learn what a clitoris was until I actually started watching pornography. And I saw that when the attention was focused on female pleasure, a lot of attention was paid to that particular area. And that's what, enabled me to explore my own body and realize that that was something that I needed in order to really enjoy sex. Which I was then able to communicate onward to all my future partners. I think, though, that brings up an interesting point kind of surrounding female sexuality. So the next question you wanted us to answer was, how does the consequences for sexual deviance differ between the sexes? So this is something I find very interesting, because as a woman who consumes pornographic material, as a woman who masturbates, that is not something that is considered socially acceptable and part of the mainstream. Male masturbation, male consumption of pornography is, but as a woman, it is not something you talk about. It is not something that you bring up. It is something that if you do mention, it raises quite a few eyebrows. To quote Eric Good, on page 219, sexual non-normativeness is usually more deviant when engaged in by women than men. Women are expected to conform more closely to sex and gender roles than men, and their transgressions are typically noticed and condemned by men. So female sexuality has been utilized for thousands of years as a way of controlling women. So when you force women to repress their sexual identity, which can be a very fundamental part of who they are, you're enforcing a mechanism of control on them. Which is why I think we live in a society that does not acknowledge female sexuality in any way, shape, or form, because that reinforces the patriarchal construct that men get to enjoy sex, women don't, which further reinforces male dominance over women. I think that's a very constructionist approach, but I think it does resonate and reflect the issues surrounding female sexuality in our society. And something else you wanted us to bring up is constructionism versus positivism in regards to sexual deviance. So again, to quote Good, the essentialist sees sex as a drive that exists to some degree independent of and prior to social context or definition. So to the positivist, sexual identity is innate. It's just part of your physiological being. They acknowledge it as just a part of the human existence. Whereas the constructionist looks at it more as how does sexual identity develop from a social standpoint? How does society influence the sexual identities that, we develop? How does society influence sexuality? And how is sexuality part of social interaction? I think that positivism is important in the sense that if we're talking about female sexuality as a form of deviance, if you say, I have a clitoris, and if you rub that clitoris, I will become sexually stimulated. That's a very basic primal part of the female body, and I appreciate positivism in the sense that it almost acknowledges that. What I appreciate about constructionism, though, is it looks at why the demonization of female sexuality has developed, and until you really understand how that is solely a societal construct, you're not going to be able to deconstruct the stigma surrounding it, and therefore bring female sexuality, female masturbation, female consumption of pornography into the mainstream. So yeah, that's pretty much it for that. Yeah. Bye.